Now, most people would agree that trying to manage a city of more than 20 million people is no mean feat, and especially in a challenging economic and financial climate. Well, that is the task that awaits whoever emerges victorious in Nigeria's impending governorship election in Lagos on March 18. The stakes are high, not just politically, but economically, as Lagos, Nigeria's commercial capital, is set to contribute around 30% of the country's GDP, and its economic trajectory could determine Nigeria's long-term economic prospects. It's also grappling with numerous infrastructure, demographic, socioeconomic, and security challenges. But on the flip side, it has made a name for itself as a tech hub, rapidly advancing towards a 24-hour economy and as a fashion and entertainment capital of sorts in Africa. On the show this morning to discuss Lagos State's economic prospect is governorship candidate of the African Democratic Congress in the forthcoming state elections, Doherty. Prior to his foray into politics, he was a private sector practitioner in financial services with a career ranging from investment banking to asset management. He was most recently the MD of Pal Pension, where he led a nationwide team overseeing the management over ₦500 billion in assets. Thanks for joining me on the show today, Mr. Doherty. Good to have you here.
Thank you, Rolake. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So one of the core principles of your Tiger agenda is bringing equity to taxation across different socioeconomic classes by introducing a progressive tax system as well as reforms to tax administration. So the question really is taxation really Lagos's best hope for boosting internally generated revenue? What are your thoughts?
Okay, thank you. It's a good question. You see, our tax reform agenda is not so much primarily about IGR. It's really about, in the first place, ensuring that there's equity in the tax system. And so, you know, people who earn the most paying the most, and people who earn the least paying a reduced burden of tax, which has generally not been the case, or often not been the case, because when you add unofficial levies together with taxes, you'll find that people in the very low income bracket, like commercial bus drivers, market women, etc., are actually paying a high effective rate of tax. So it's more about creating equity. But we're also looking to drive prosperity and growth with our tax policy. So being tax friendly to small and medium businesses and also supporting large businesses to enable them to be more successful. Because over time, what then happens is that the economy becomes more broadly prosperous, businesses can start and thrive and then grow. So it's not really about tax driving IGR, it's more about tax policy, setting up the economy for prosperity, for growth, being equitable in that process. And then ultimately, IGR will essentially be a byproduct of that process.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting you mentioned economic activity and the business environment. And one of the key drivers and catalysts for that is obviously going to be infrastructure development. The incumbent administration is spending around 27.3% of its budget this year on infrastructure development. What are your thoughts on, what the divide might be between physical and social infrastructure, and, what sort of investment management will deliver the best outcome for a city and a state like Lagos?
Okay, so this is an area where there's always discussion around physical infrastructure, capital expenditure, recurrent expenditure, and generally the conventional wisdom has been that if you're spending a lot on capital expenditure, you are basically doing well, and that you will improve the lives of people over time because you build a productive base of the economy. But one of the things that we have argued is that it cannot be capital expenditure for capital expenditure's sake. We have to think about how effectively and efficiently that money is being spent, because if you're getting, if you're not getting 9 or 10 naira worth of value for every 10 naira you spend, and you're getting more like 2 or 3 naira worth of value, you actually will be impoverishing the economy over time. So we think that there's been an excessive focus on capital expenditure, which has not been managed transparently. And this is why over time, you will see that even though there's been massive investments in physical infrastructure through capital expenditure year in, year out, when you measure things like quality of life by global reference indices, you find that Lagos tends to come in at the bottom. So we're spending the money, but we're not getting the value, and people's lives are not being improved.
Yeah, I mean, you make a really good point there, but I would ask that if you look at the sort of slew of projects that have been invested in by the government or that have been undertaken by the incumbent administration, you know, the development of roads and bridges and transportation networks surely are a good thing to drive economic activity, don't you think?
I think there are, but I mean, the question is, you know, how efficiently are those being done? And are we doing the right ones? And do we have the right priorities? So, for example, you know, 15 years on, we don't have a rail, a functional commuter rail within Lagos, despite the fact that that project has been on for 14 years. So the question is, you know, how effective has that expenditure been? I think also there's the two other things that I would mention. One is that, you know, we also have to think about the extent to which we're managing our existing or using our existing infrastructure well. Are we getting the most from our existing infrastructure? Because if we're not managing those well, ensuring that, you know, we don't have chaos and disorder on our roads, for example, then we'll continue building new infrastructure, and the infrastructure will never be enough. So this combination of thinking about what things are we doing the right things, and even those things that we're doing, are we spending the money efficiently and effectively, and is there transparency and accountability around it, and are people's lives being improved as a result? I think that ultimately is the yardstick by which governance should be measured.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the issue on the quality of spend is quite important, but I'd like to hear more specifically what are some of the reforms or things that need to happen for that transparency and accountability to be more evident in the expending of public money?
Yeah. So I think generally the whole notion of putting things in the public domain, where you're talking about large public sector projects, public works projects, I think information around that should be in the public domain. I think that in the areas of PPPs where we've used, which have been used extensively in Lagos, I think the bar for transparency and openness around those is even higher, because it involves both private and public sector working together, and there are often private interests in there. And so it's important for those to be out there in the public domain so that people see. One example that I would just point to is the recent fourth mainland bridge, which is proposed. And one of the things that we have said is that when we come in, we will review that project, because this is a $2.5 billion project. We have to think about that project in the context of the alternative uses of that kind of money in an economy like Lagos. And also think about how we bring the information around that and the whole contracting process around that into the public domain. Again, this is a PPP. So that information should be out there so that we know what we're committing the citizens of Lagos to on their behalf as their government.
Okay, so I guess I wanted to take this a bit further. You know, one of the peculiarities of Lagos is if you look at the way the city is configured, you have these sort of highbrow areas, you have your urban sprawl and your residential slums and highly population-dense areas. Do you have an actual infrastructure master plan for Lagos? Is there an optimal way this state and this city should be designed? And if so, what are you specifically proposing to help re-engineer the way we live and work in Lagos?
So there are a couple of things. First of all, you know, the first thing is that in defining infrastructure for a modern megacity like Lagos, I think that, you know, I don't think we often define it as comprehensively as we should. So often we think about roads and road infrastructure. But, you know, we think it should be comprehensively defined. So transit is just one, and in transit you have road, rail, and water. But you know, you have water, you have power, you have waste, you have security infrastructure, you have tech and telecoms infrastructure, you have environmental infrastructure, which relates to the flooding-related issues and so on. And I think beyond having an overall master plan, there has to be a plan, and indeed a master plan for each of these specific areas. We also believe in a government of continuity, so we will not jettison the Lagos master plan. We will take a deep look at it, determine which parts of it we believe need to be retained and which parts of it we need to rework. And we will not be shy to do that. And we'll have the fresh mandate with which to do that. So, but to the other part of your question, one of the things that's important to do, if you look at Lagos, even though Lagos is a small geographic area, even within that small geographic area, there's a massive concentration within the central region of the state in terms of the population. And we think that part of that is the urban planning and the way in which the city has sort of evolved and where people have settled. And we think that more could be done to decentralize. An important part of that is what you do with the transit mechanisms and the transportation infrastructure. Because if we have the appropriate transit infrastructure so that people can commute by rail easily or other means from outlying areas like Ikorodu, for example, or Ekpe, for example, then you could actually have a decentralization of the city. And then commercial activity could actually develop around those other axes. And you can also have housing infrastructure develop. And then you can almost have, you know, hubs of activity where people can live and work over time. But the important driver of all of this is kind of the transportation and transit infrastructure that brings different parts of the city into play as a place to live and work.
Yeah, Mr. Doherty, one big threat that is often really not spoken of is climate change. I mean, we've seen rising sea levels in Lagos. Waste management is a problem. Do you have a specific solution around the scourge of climate change? Because this infrastructure development will take place in a world where many African cities, which are coastal, are facing an increasing threat of complete decimation from the threat of climate change. What would you hope to do to address that problem?
So I think remember when I spoke about infrastructure, I talked about environmental infrastructure. And just like other types of infrastructure, you have to have a plan around environmental infrastructure. And part of the way to think about it is that when you see flooding is not, it's an outcome, right? And it's an outcome of the way in which, you know, climate has been planned for. And if you have perennial flooding, it's a reflection of the fact that we have not planned adequately and put in place the infrastructural components for a city like Lagos, which we know is a coastal city in a global environment of climate change. And therefore, things like channels, the appropriate protection of wetlands, you know, to manage that flooding activity, all of those things have to be thought of proactively. And you think about these things sort of 10 years ahead, maybe 20 years ahead. And I think that is not we have not done that. And so when the rains come around, it becomes a firefighting exercise, and you can't manage the economy that way. So this is the approach that we would take. And you know, in thinking about how we prioritize things, this is one of the important things that we have to think about. So, you know, when I talk about, for example, you know, thinking about $2.5 billion that we want to put into the Fourth Mainland Bridge, is that the appropriate use of those resources? That question must be considered in light of this broad consideration of the different aspects of the infrastructural framework that's needed to make a city like Lagos work.
Yeah, and of course, all of these investments are going to take huge amounts of money to do so. You have a background in the pension industry. I know you were a pioneer chairman of ARM Pensions, for instance. Do you see long-term capital markets as a viable fundraising option for sub-sovereigns like a Lagos state government? And, what would be your approach to fundraising? Where would you be looking to source funds for the work you would want to do?
Yeah. So, yes, I do see the private markets as a source of funding. I think Lagos is fortunate in the sense that we have a viable, underlying, vibrant economy, which, by the way, is operating in many ways in spite of government, not, benefiting from government support. And so think about how much more could be done if government is more proactive in supporting them. I think that because we have that commercial viability, that we then have a credibility, a debt capacity, and those kinds of things that enable us to be viewed favorably, by the providers of capital. And that's been our experience in Lagos. So even though I think that those expenditures have not generally often been transparently and accountably undertaken, I think people just realize that, the momentum that the economy has because of the fact that it's a commercial center, makes it an attractive destination for capital. But we could do so much more. We could do so much more. And I think that we will continue to look to the private sector in a broad range of areas, including, by the way, things like affordable housing, which is where I think, a lot of focus needs to be.
Yeah, but one thing that is potentially of concern is debt sustainability, even though there's a presumption that Lagos is a credit-worthy entity because of the level of economic activity.
Yeah.
But given what is happening with monetary policy, inflation targeting globally, there will be concerns around the sustainability of government borrowing, even at subnational level. How would a state like Lagos look to manage those sorts of concerns?
Well, I think that this is something that must always be managed. I think that, you must have your debt management capacity within the government, thinking about how much should the government be borrowing, in what forms should it be borrowing it, how sustainable is it. And these are things that, you plan several years ahead, maybe decades, but you also have a constant reassessment as you go along. I mean, it's almost, we don't need to wait for high interest rate cycles to be thinking about that. As you are fundraising, as you are issuing debt, as you are issuing bonds, you're thinking about the interest rate cycle, understanding that rates are sometimes low and sometimes high. And when rates are low, you don't go and borrow yourself to the hilt because you can borrow to the hilt because rates are low, because someday rates will move in a different direction. So all of this, I think, is a part of the financial management of the activities of the state, which actually should be a core part of managing the state. And we'll have an excellent team in place to do that.
Yes. Yes. So thank you for that response. So, are there cities or municipalities in emerging or frontier markets that potentially provide a great reference point for Lagos in terms of economic development? I know it's quite a unique demographic, but is there a global best practice standard an administration in Lagos State should be trying to meet? And if so, what can we actually learn from those states or cities?
Well, I think that I don't know that I'll pick out a place and say this is, but I think that, there are things that we can pick from different places, and that would be sort of the way I would think about it. So if you think some of things like around environmental awareness, things like how plastics are managed and the rules around that and what is allowed and what is not. Places like Kigali in Rwanda, have been quite progressive in their thinking around some of those environmental things. I think beyond just frontier markets, though, I think if we look at markets that have gone through a path that we would like to go through to get to a place where we think would be better for our citizens, those are the kinds of places we should look at. So, for example, Singapore has done a number of things which I think we can also, Lagos in particular, can emulate. So one of the things that I will point to, for example, is that Singapore had a deliberate policy of ensuring that it upskilled its population with technical education, a large part of the population, in addition to the formal education. And the goal of this was to ensure that that population became an attractive, capacitated population for businesses that were looking to now establish, industry, manufacturing facilities, etc., because you had a technical capacity in place to man and people those businesses. And because Singapore was on the coast, as is Lagos, it became an attractive destination for those kinds of businesses who actually came and settled. And that became a linchpin of that Singaporean economy. And I think that Lagos, and I've spoken about this, and I think that Lagos could do the same thing. We have a large population, we're on the coast. It's an English-speaking population, a young population. And one of the things we've said in our educational agenda is that we want to expand technical education of the 1.5 million odd kids in public schools today. Less than 1% are in any form of technical education. And we need to change that structure. And I think that this would augur well for Lagos.
Yeah, Mr. Doherty, thank you. We've almost run out of time, but I have two more questions I need to put forward to you. So you mentioned, countries like Singapore, but one of the things that people have often talked about is whether there's a more optimal way to conduct economic management in Lagos. So you have a state government, you have local governments. Is there a need to look at other types of administration or governance structures, such as creating a mayor or creating new municipalities that could get better engaged with local authorities and manage many of these socioeconomic issues in a more detailed and dynamic way? That's the first question. And the second question is, Lagos has a thriving startup and technology ecosystem. It was recently boosted, of course, by the Startup Act. What more can be done to support entrepreneurs? You talked about young people and skills, at giving the peculiarities of the operating business environment in this mega city.
So I'll start with the second question first. So with if you look at the tech and entertainment sectors, actually, again, these are sectors that they've achieved a lot of the time what they have, in spite of the environment in which they've operated. It's not clear to me that government has necessarily been supportive of them. They face environmental and infrastructural challenges to the establishments of those businesses. Many of them start off as small businesses and go through some of the hardships that small businesses go through in dealing with, in getting off the ground. And so as a government, I think I think there are a couple of things we can do. One is to generally make ourselves a partner to these folks rather than being a predator. And I think this also relates to our government reform agenda, which I've talked about. Infrastructure that supports these businesses, whether it's the tech and telecoms infrastructure, supporting them with parks and creative areas where those kinds of businesses can locate and localize, so that you have sharing of ideas and you have creativity growing. And then essentially understanding that these are areas where we can have comparative advantage globally. We can actually create global champions in this area. And it's not in every area we can create global champions, because we are handicapped in many areas because of our level of development in other aspects. But in areas like this, we can be global champions. And indeed, we have produced global champions in these businesses. And so it must, as a manager, when we think about allocating resources, these are the kinds of areas you should look at. To your first question, which has to do with how you manage, different models for managing the economy. I think it's not so much about creating new models. I think it's about operating our existing models well. We have a local government model. There are local governments in place. The problem is, and these are they are governments that are close to the people and should be managing, what they know to be the needs of the people. Working, of course, with the state government within an overall framework that is cohesive. But the problem that we've had is that the local governments have not had the capacity, and at the same time also the resources, they've been starved of the resources to do that work. And those two things go hand in hand. Resources should be close to the people who understand the needs of the people and should be devolved to the local governments. But at the same time you do that, you must have a system, and as you know, the elections to the local governments are handled by the state government, not INEC. And so a lot of the time, what that system produces is what those who are in control of the state government want. And often that has to do with things like loyalty and so on, rather than a meritocratic system. So I would say two things need to happen. We need to devolve resources to the local governments, which are closer to the people so they can do the work. But at the same time we're doing that, we must ensure that our system is emphasizing meritocracy and the production of capable managers to do that work, rather than people who will be, for political reasons, loyal to a particular group.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Doherty. So a final, very, very brief response, please, is really around the goal of the current incumbent administration to decentralize electricity generation and distribution specifically, and for underserved communities. We don't have a lot of time, but do you think this is a panacea for tackling the state's power supply woes? Of course, a very important issue for businesses and households.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know if it's a panacea, but I think that I'm always in favor of reducing monopolistic power. And I think one of the things that has been a bane of distribution infrastructure, distribution structure and framework is the idea that some of these discos are monopolies. And where you have monopolies, you know, it's always a challenge to manage. So if there are things that move us away from a monopolistic environment to a situation where people can benefit from competition among businesses, I'm all in support of it.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Funsho Doherty, governorship candidate of the African Democratic Congress. Thanks for sharing your thoughts on the Lagos state economy. That's all on Business Week. There's certainly a lot to look forward to and watch out for over the coming week, including in Nigeria as it prepares for the governorship and state assembly elections.